Over the last 20 years, we've learned that genetics plays a key role in Alzheimer's disease. And there's two types. There's the genetics that gives you the early onset form. It strikes under 60. And that's pretty rare. That's less than 5%. But in that case, the gene mutations, when you inherit them from mom or dad, they guarantee the disease. So they're terrible because they guarantee disease, usually in your 50s or 40s. We even have a family where they get it in their 20s. But in most cases of Alzheimer's, they strike, disease hits after 60. And there, it's genes that contain variants that are more common in the population, and those just increase your susceptibility. But we also know of gene variants that protect you. So it's very complicated. So when what we're working toward is a real test where we can take the protective genes, the genes that are putting you at risk, combine it together and say, okay, now what's your final overall risk for your life? And then, of course, in most cases, lifestyle, despite genetics, is going to play a key role in your overall life, whether you're going to get the disease. The genes have taught us the pathway of the disease. So we know that first you form these things called plaques in the brain, and then nerve cells react to them and form these twisted fibrils inside called tangles. Nerve cells start dying, and then eventually there's inflammation in the brain, and that's what really takes you out. But what we want to know just as much as we do about the cause, and as we try to develop, drugs for people who really need help, we're really interested in knowing lifestyle, like what is a healthy lifestyle for preventing the disease from striking. And we're also interested in knowing what is the experience of a patient who's in the late stages of Alzheimer's and has no continuity of time, no sense of cognitive self. So the pure self is still there inside, the pure awareness. But the consciousness as a cognitive being on Earth basically slowly goes away. What does that feel like? And this is something we're also interested in. So we can help even caregivers, family members, to deal with their loved ones who have the disease. The sense of personal self depends on memory. So the evolution of the brain has been toward personal self. So in the beginning, you had just the brain stem, the reptilian brain, your instincts. You're a lizard, you're on a boardwalk at a beach in Florida, some tourists come scampering by, you're running under the boardwalk. There's no memory needed, there's nothing needed, just startle response, fight or flight. You know you have to eat, you know you have to mate. That's the extent of self. Memory is not needed. But then when you have higher, then you get to the next stage of evolution of the brain, to the 100 million years ago. The brainstem, lizard brain, reptilian brain was 300 million years ago. 100 million years ago, along comes the limbic brain. Emotion and short-term memory together. So you say, why do you need those together? What's the link? Well, most emotions are based on fear or desire. Fear, when you're actually thinking about the future and saying, oh, I'm anxious about the future, comes from the memory of pain. You've been conditioned. Desire, you're looking forward to something, comes from the memory of pleasure. You've been also. And of course, Nisa Gadata said all these things, and it's all very true at the neuroscience level. So now, once you have emotions that are based on fear and desire, they require memory. But they only require, some extent of memory. But then, the brain evolved higher 4 million years ago. You get this neocortex. And now, the limbic system, the earlier one, gave you the ability to bond and form family groups and social groups, to take care of each other. There's the first vestiges of love are being born. And then the newest part of the brain comes in and gives you meaning and purpose and identity, creativity, vision. insight, intuition. Intuition versus instinct. Very different. A lot of people say, oh, I go by my instincts. Well, no, you don't go by your instincts. That just means you're going to be trying to eat whatever you can and mate wherever you can. That's instinct. And you'll fight or flee as needed. Intuition is very different. The gut feeling is intuition. So the newest part of the brain has given now self-awareness. And it's with self-awareness that we can finally say, wait a minute, I'm not my brain. My brain's allowing me to be self-aware, but I know I have a brain, and I can be the witness to observe what's going on in my brain without identifying with it. I can see a red car and say, I see a red car, but I don't say I am a red car. And when someone upsets me, I can say, my brain's bringing me the feeling of anger or sadness, but I don't say, I am angry, I am sad. I don't identify with the feeling just as much as I don't identify with the red car. It's something my brain brings me. So this is an incredible step in evolution to have that self-awareness. And that's what goes in Alzheimer's disease. So by the time you get to the late stages, where there's no short-term memory, sensory information is coming in and going nowhere, they're living completely as possible in the moment. There's no continuity from one second to the next. But what good is it without some sense of self at the level of living on this earth and having an identity and a personality? Can you realize the bliss of living perfectly in the moment without the self that the brain gives you as a gift for living on this earth? And of course, they still have the self with the capital S from pure awareness. It's inside. That doesn't go away. But to really enjoy the combination of the pure self and having the gift of a body and brain on earth, you need cognitive self. And the terrible thing about Alzheimer's disease is that's what you lose. There are a subset of neuroscientists who are getting past the reductionist view that we're nothing more than our nerve cells firing and the emotions and thoughts that come along with that. The majority view is still, there's no mind without the brain. You're nothing more than your brain. Your entire consciousness is based on the thoughts and feelings that you have because of your brain. Neuroscientists mostly believe that what you experience in the memory of feelings, images, thoughts are actually in your brain. So I challenge them all the time. Say, where are they? How's that? I can recall right now the feeling I had from my first kiss. Where's that? How do you store that in the brain? Is it in the lipid, the fat, the water? How do you store that in lipid, fat, and water and protein? How do you do that? Tell me about it. And then you get there, well, you know, it's in there. The synapses all form and they make it. I'm like, oh, they just make it. What synapses do, what the neural network does, is it creates memory traces, pathways. It tells you, it teaches you how to recall memories, record memories. It's a device for recording and recalling and associating them together, so that when you smell a certain cologne, you think of a certain person you knew in the past, and now you're seeing the city you were in, and these associations keep going. Memory traces connected together, 100 billion neurons, hundreds of trillions of connections, synapses, allow you to do that. But does that tell us the feeling you had when you smelled that cologne and you were in Paris with that boyfriend one day? Does that tell you, you know, where that feeling's stored? No. You need the brain, yeah. So you need a brain, and you need the cognitive self to experience the bliss that comes with a perfect meditation, where you've cleared your mind, you're tapping into pure awareness, you've gone non-local. The mistake is to believe, oh, now I don't have any brain activity. You can't do it without a brain. the brain is always going to be the projector. It's always making the movie. Okay? But that doesn't mean, just like when you project a movie, it doesn't mean that the movie exists inside the projector. Right? Just like when you hear music on the radio, you hear a band playing on the radio. The band's not in the radio. But we're happy to say that the experiences and the memories are in the brain. If you have a recorder, you record and then you play it back. Or if it's a projector, you play a film through it. It's the transceiver and the receiver both at once. But even the most sublime feelings of unity, oneness with the universe, tapping into being just pure awareness, being aware of awareness, all the things we strive for when we meditate, you need a brain to experience it. So sometimes when people say to me, don't you think in Alzheimer's they must be really happy living in the moment? I'm like, well no, because they don't know they're living in the moment. You still have to know, you still have to be aware of the beautiful gifts that pure awareness bring you. And that's probably why we're born. It's why there's a universe. It's why there's consciousness. Pure awareness, God, everything, existence, can only do one thing, be aware. It can only be aware of one thing, itself. So all of this is just an amazing amount of feedback loops of pure awareness being aware of itself. And as soon as that awareness takes an object within itself to be aware of, you create consciousness. And of course, it seems like a subject-object split, but it's not, because the only thing pure awareness can be aware of is itself. So it's all one loop. So you substitute subject-object with a loop of awareness looking back at itself. And we are a higher ordered structure, assembly of consciousness, a colony of bacteria and human cells that have come together as one way to create a universe of consciousness that is a result of that pure awareness being aware of itself. We're just one. These loops of awareness becoming aware of itself, further evolving worlds of consciousness in local time and space, follow the rule of self-organization. The intelligence, the purpose, the design in it all requires nothing more than the fact that awareness is aware of awareness. Because in this loop, in a self-organizing system, as soon as you create something, it could be a thought, a word, a deed, anything, a piece of art, music, a facial expression, anything that you manifest has to come back to regulate, monitor, and govern you. Self-organizing system. This is how information can densify, how you can have the evolution of complex systems of information and consciousness that occur harmoniously, homeostatically, in perfect balance. That's how we can be 90% bacteria, how 90% of our DNA can be bacterial, not human, because we're this incredibly beautiful, balanced colony of bacteria that live with us, that allow us to survive. We couldn't survive without them. They couldn't survive without us. It's perfectly symbiotic, it's balanced, and it arose out of self-organization. Lower organisms, resembling the first ones that appeared on Earth, still being necessary to unite with us, to create us who can have self-awareness beyond their wildest little bacterial dreams, if they have dreams. The beauty and the balance of our bodies that are vehicles for pure awareness and consciousness. Our body is a construct of consciousness in which pure awareness can be aware of itself. The beauty of it is it can be no other way. We cannot be any other way. This is exactly as it should be, because it all evolved with complete purpose and direction. And then when people hear that, they think, oh, intelligent design, God with a big paintbrush, also giving us the rules, what's right and wrong. No, it's living in God. It's living in pure awareness. It's being pure awareness, becoming aware of itself at some level of a conscious construct. We are a conscious construct. When we die, the conscious construct is just reconfigured, nothing more. You reconfigure the consciousness. So through self-organization, we're exactly where we should be right now, and we're still going. We're still evolving. It never stops. The Earth is still evolving. The solar system is still evolving. The galaxy, the universe is still evolving, following self-organizing principles. What's cool about us is that we're made of baryonic matter, higher, heavier elements beyond hydrogen and helium that make up 0.03% of the entire universe. So, as someone once said, if the universe is a cake with tons of cake and frosting, we're a tiny little pinch of cinnamon on top. That's all of the visible universe, including us. And we're even more special because we're not just hydrogen and helium like a star. We have big elements like carbon and phosphorus and nitrogen. So we are right now pretty high up on the ability of consciousness to order itself into much higher ordered structures of dense information. We're dense information. We're highly sophisticated information that's reached this level of balance. We should be very, very grateful for that. Every experience you have is changing the wiring of your brain. Your the neural networks in your brain making these memory maps and memory traces are completely malleable, plastic. They change all the time in response to your experiences, in response to every word, thought, and deed, in response to your mind, in response to your perspective and your attitude. Simply how you choose to silently react to what's going on around you based on your attitude or your perspective is changing your neural network. Over time, if something happens to be repetitive, you're experiencing the same thing over, let's say, even 30 seconds, there's repetition in a lecture you're hearing. The same theme keeps coming up. Now, not only do you change your neurochemistry, your neural network, your synapses, you change your genetics. You don't change the composition of the genes. You don't change the DNA sequence of A's, G's, C's, and T's that make up the gene. You change the gene activity. So experiences change gene activity. They turn genes up and down. When gene activity changes, the structure of the DNA itself changes. So if you picture the DNA as these long filaments that, if you look close, had that double helix shape. And they're all folded on each other. And then there are proteins that hold it together, called histones. At any given moment, this thing is changing like if you had a, Play-Doh in your hand. It's changing so that the fresh, wet parts of the Play-Doh inside are now exposed and the dry parts outside that dried up because you are inside. So you're constantly exposing certain parts of the DNA and hiding other parts. And that's part of the way, that's partially how gene activity is regulated, exposing parts of the DNA. So when you have a certain experience and you change gene activity, you're also changing the structure of the DNA in certain areas, in certain genes that were exposed, now exposed, that were hidden before. In this process, the chances for mutation change. So you may have a certain gene that was hidden, and now something happened. You smelled a certain solvent. I don't know, you got stressed out, whatever it is. And now that gene's exposed because its activity is going up in response to that experience, a negative experience. And now because it's exposed, for the first time it gets a mutation. And that mutation in that one cell leads to dysregulation. That cell says, self-organization, phooey, I'm going to do what I want. You can't regulate me. And now you get cancer. That cell becomes a tumor. Or this can happen in sperm and egg. New mutations can happen in sperm and in eggs that your parents didn't have. They're called de novo mutations. So now when you have a child, this child's inheriting new gene mutations that neither mom or dad had. They occurred anew in the sperm and egg. So this is how, from one generation to the next, we can react to the world around us and change the next generation of people without waiting, as Darwin said, hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. Darwin's idea was mutations are random, wrong, X. Mutations occur also as a result of how you're experiencing your world because of how the DNA reacts. And then once you have that mutation, it can immediately affect the next generation if it happened in the egg and sperm. It doesn't take 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years. So we have to overturn what Darwin just could not have known. It wasn't his fault. In Superbrain, when we talk about that you're not your brain, you're the user of your brain, the first thing we point out is we're not telling you to control your brain. Because that means you're interfering with the natural intelligence of self-organization. Our only role is to create. And then what we create controls us. But we can just choose what we create. So you create your brain. You act as, it's like raising a kid. You guide it, you lead it. But to control it doesn't work. Resistance always leads to persistence. So the idea of controlling just doesn't fit well with the way of the universe. Self-organization says the control comes in a perfectly natural way as it should be, following creativity. Our only role is to create. Once we start trying to control, then we get it backwards. And then you suffer and you become extinct. You go away. Self-organization says go away. You're trying to control, that's our job. That's the inherent job of awareness. Don't try to use your puny little consciousness with your puny little brain just because you think 100 trillion synapses is great. Wow. But guess what? You still can't control. You don't know enough. So that's the issue. Now, I always like to think, I always think that when I teach students, to clearly differentiate between understanding and explaining. And you should always inside understand and never explain. And then very carefully choose what you want to explain, only after you've done a lot of understanding. Understanding is infinite. Understanding inside, tapping into awareness, intuition, is infinite. Explaining is finite. You have to use laryngeal grunt sounds that are limited to explain. It's even worse than only having 100 trillion synapses. So I say the worst mistake you can make when you're doing scientific endeavor and you're trying to, think about your problems and think about how to treat Alzheimer's or how to understand what goes wrong in Alzheimer's. The mistake is to try to already explain what's going on in your head, which means you're reiterating laryngeal grunt sounds in your head. It's not going to get you anywhere. It's too limited. Understand abstractly first. Freely associate ad absurdum inside. Become a complete idiot inside. Don't tell anybody, especially if you're at Harvard. Just let it happen. Then, after you've done this exercise of understanding, see what you feel you would want to explain. explain it as a hypothesis, and then go out there scientifically to test it. And your only job as a scientist testing a hypothesis is to disprove it. The role of a scientist is only to disprove a hypothesis. You take your favorite hypothesis that comes out of a lot of contemplation and understanding, and then you go to the lab bench and you try to disprove it, because the odds are 50 to 1, it's wrong. And just look at now, when we look back 50 to 100 years ago, how much of it was right versus wrong. It's probably 1 in 50. It's not any different right now. So go in there being realistic and try to show that what you just came up with after days of work is wrong. And then when the experiment is done, you take the little threads of truth that came out of it, and you use those to go through the process again. Try to understand, at some point explain, come up with a hypothesis, try to disprove it. And eventually what you do is you take these little threads of truth and you start knitting a fabric of truth. And over your career as a scientist, that fabric of truth gets bigger and bigger. And it doesn't matter how big it is. It's better to have one tiny little swath of fabric that's truth than what a lot of scientists have, which is a big blanket of falsehood. So that's what I try to teach my students. It's the same thing.
It's the same thing.
Science and spiritual practice are the same thing if you're doing it right. You know, in science, what are we seeking? The truth. In spirituality, what are we seeking? We're seeking the truth. There's only one way to seek the truth, and that is to know what isn't. It's mostly, it's not. So in science, your only job is to show what's not after you've come up with a really good idea about what might be. And then just keep going, just keep producing that fabric of truth with one thread at a time. It's tedious and it takes a long time. But sometimes you can get a huge insight or an intuition where you take a quantum leap forward. And so I also tell my students, you know, don't be afraid to use your intuition. You know, I fully admit to them that I use lucid dreaming to guide my science. I use lucid dreaming twice a week to ask questions about what I should do in my experiments. And it's been a good experience. They usually, people I talk to in lucid dreams usually tell me very good information, very, very valuable. So, I mean, you know, it's funny because New York Times interviewed a bunch of scientists about, you know, what's special about you? How'd you make all these big discoveries? And I went into lucid dreaming, and then a lot of my donors and people who donate money to me were so embarrassed. They're like, because then their friends were saying, this is the person you support, and he does experiments based on dreams. So, and I said, well, just show them my papers. Just show them the discoveries. The data and the discoveries speak for themselves. So don't worry about how I got there. Don't judge. Yeah. My science got interconnected with spirituality when I started reading Carlos Castaneda. And I almost dropped out of science when I was quite young, because when I read about the toxicity of self-importance, expectation, how the biggest drain on energy in the body that you need to feed intuition comes from the need for external validation, acceptance, propping up self-importance. That if you were a house, self-importance and the need for external validation would be the refrigerator and the AC. It's where all the energy goes. And without that energy, you can't lucid dream, and without that energy, you can't feed your intuition. So I said, how am I going to stay in a field that's based on external validation? It's peer review. Your grants get reviewed by others, and they have to approve you. Your papers get submitted to journals. They get reviewed by your peers. They have to approve you. So I said, here I am feeling the most important thing in the world is to not have expectation, not seek external validation or acceptance, and to not feed self-importance. Yet in science, it's rife with self-importance, pride, and the need for external validation. So it's been a conflict my whole life, to this day, that I still have to deal with. But simply being cognizant of it, simply observing it, being aware of it, not being afraid of it, just being aware of it, and then the intuition, just the simple fact of observing the problem helps the intuition to come through to solve the problem. And that's whatever was done. So I still follow a lot of the wonderful things I learned from Castaneda. I reread Castaneda all the time. Yeah. Eagle's Gift is probably my favorite.
The Art of Dreaming?
Art of Dreaming, yeah, I also read. I just finished rereading that again. Yeah, I mean, my heroes in terms of reading, besides Castaneda, of course, Nisargadatta, and also I'm very good friends with the Hindu monastery in Kauai, and
oh, the one with the
yeah, and so I know the guru there, Bodhinatha, and Subramanya Swami, the guru who started it. I've done the master course with them. I've done the inner search. We've done my wife and I have done the inner search retreats, and my daughter. We go there at least once a year just to meditate, and yeah, it's a great place. And so a lot of when I wrote Superbrain, when I was writing the first, the draft that would go to Deepak for each chapter, basically on my screen I had I Am That open, and I had Gurudeva Subramanya Swami from the Hindu monasteries merging with Shiva open, and these two books were probably the main spiritual guides that were guiding what I wrote in the first drafts of the Superbrain book. Because they hit it, they knew. You're not your brain. You're the witness, you're the observer. You're navigating the mind with the brain. You're navigating consciousness. You're consciousness, navigating consciousness. That's that easy. That's all there is. And I have to say that before I met Deepak, I still believed in a material world. And one day we were shooting a video. Deepak and I did some videos in his office, discussing something. And I remember at that moment, I tapped his desk. And for the first time, I became completely convinced that to believe in a material world is more childish than believing in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. To think that there are material trinkets floating around in some magical house called the universe, but it just came from somewhere. I mean, let's face it, 500 years from now, they'll look back and they'll say, never mind believing the earth was flat. They'll say, these poor people thought it was real. They thought this material stuff was real. And they'll look back at the early days of quantum physics coming into the play, and they'll say, look how long it took. I mean, they had the information they needed in the early 1900s to get this right. And then a small subgroup of them got it right, like it's sand, But, that was still like less than 0.5%, less than 0.5% of the world. And look, but finally, after hundreds of years, they got it. They finally realized there's no material world. It's all just consciousness. So a lot of us are going to look pretty foolish from this age. I don't know how. I mean, what you explained is perfectly how I would say it happens too. But how this information is hidden in consciousness that you tap into, how many layers are there? I mean, simplistically, I would think, pure awareness and everything's there at once, and then, one good round of feedback loop, awareness being aware. Awareness creates the consciousness of that new equation or product. But I think it'll be a long time before we know. I mean, my intuition says that there's pure awareness, and then there's just different, there's different levels of consciousness. And in a lucid dream, you're tapping into beings who you can't see you, because even though you're not on the same wavelength with their consciousness. And some of them you're not. So So I think it does all come from quantum probability and collapse, but it may be from different levels of consciousness down and up rather than just from one pure awareness all the time. I still like Castaneda's onion, you know, peeling back the layers of attention. He called it attention, but it's really awareness plus attention equals consciousness. So awareness without attention is just awareness. And so there are different layers of consciousness based on where the attention of the awareness went. First attention, you could say Castaneda, first attention, second attention, third attention. So, and there's frequency. And that frequency is reflected in the brain. You're going to have more access to deeper consciousness at delta at a slower frequency than at alpha. So little by little we'll figure it all out.